Are we rolling? We are rolling. Unfiltered thoughts. I'm right in the middle of working. I took a break, so I'm going to try to shoot this video quick. I have some notes. This video is why the system had to erase the Indian nations. So I'm going to just try to go through this quick with these notes. So, by the way, I have this flag back here because I do have Cherokee blood in me. It's in my DNA, for those wondering. I'm sitting in my teepee. I got it moved around to where I need to move it to this year, and I'm getting ready to recover it. So that's why I'm sitting out here. I'm enjoying it. Set this up over in a certain spot so I can enjoy it whilst I'm working and I take a break. So I was working and I was out there just thinking, like, I was so frustrated because, like, the system just totally, then that goes to the point of this. The Indians did not live the way we live. And it's like, it's so much better. I've been trying to adapt to living outside of the system. And when I do, and I start living that way a little bit, and then like today has been crazy. And it's just like that hustle bustle type, you know, I got to get this done and I got to get that done and I've got a time schedule. Man, the Indians didn't live that way. They didn't live that way, and that's why they were a threat. That's one of the reasons why they were a threat. The system wants us living in a hustle bustle, work, 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 be successful, and the way that they tell us is success. And, you know, work hard, work 60, 70 hours a week, so you're tired, you don't have any time to do anything, you're spending all your money on all these things that you're supposed to spend your money on, that successful people are supposed to have, and, you know, all these things. To be a great American, we want to be, if you're a great American, you're going to work hard. See, and they looked at the Indians and they pushed the narrative, the Indians are lazy, they're lazy people. And if you try to come out of the system now and live a better way of life, you will be targeted the same way they did the Indians. So keeping that in mind, getting into my notes here, what is the goal of the system, right? So the system has goals and it has enemies, right? So the system wants to do several things, and this is just a brief outline of what it wants. It wants to keep control of us. It wants to maintain a certain narrative. Like, it's putting out all kinds of narratives, and it wants to maintain those because that's what keeps the system going. It wants to prevent people from waking up to who they really are, or a different way of being, right? Because if you start doing that, you're going to start to question the system and the narrative, and then you're not going to want their control anymore. You're going to want to get away from their control. They want to keep you busy. They want to keep you, I say you, it's you and me. They want to keep us busy. They want to keep us distracted, and they want to keep us compliant. And they want to make sure everything runs on their timeline with their economy and their definition of success. Right? Like, that is the whole thing. And so if that's the system's goal, then anything that does not fit that, then that becomes a threat. There goes a cop by on the road. I hear the sirens going to chase somebody down that's not being compliant. So if you don't fit into the system's goals, then you are going to be considered a threat. The system has enemies, and its enemies are the people who are a threat to the system. Those are people who are free thinkers, people who remember a different way of life, or start to think about, hey, there might be a different way. You start investigating things, and you maybe even start incorporating a little bit of that into your life. And then all of a sudden you say, oh, wait a minute, this isn't the way. Wait, I don't have to work 70 hours a week. I don't have to be work, make all kinds of money. Wait, hold on. And you start thinking about a different way of life. Be careful, because you could become an enemy. And anyone who questions the script or the narrative, you start questioning the narrative that the system, Satan's little system, is pushing out, then you are an enemy. And also, cultures that live off the land, or if you start to get out of the system, and then all of a sudden you start having no need for the system, like, you're not going to get completely out of the system, right? But if you cross, there's a line kind of that you can cross and you become, it sees you start getting outside that system, you know, oh, I get by with working 30 hours a week. Oh, I don't have any debt. And you start, especially you start letting other people know that, you will be an enemy, because that is not the narrative the system wants you thinking about living, because then other people might see it and you're going to talk to other people and other people start saying, oh wow, see, you only work 30 hours a week, like how do you do that? Well, I don't have any debt. I don't use the banks, you know, these things. Then all of a sudden you're gonna, oh, that person's crazy, he's lazy, he's not successful. And why were the Indian nations a threat? The Indian nations were a threat for this exact reason, because they didn't live, I mean, they were a huge threat, because you had Satan's little system coming into the Americas, and here you have these people living here, and they're not operating by any of that stuff. They're not operating by time, according to the system, right? They didn't live by time clocks. They used the way the Bible talks about. They used the sun and the moon and the days, and they didn't go like, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to be at that meeting at 3:15. I've got to hurry up. I've got to run. They didn't operate that way. It was a much different system, which we'll get into in the future. They didn't operate by banks. They didn't need the media. They didn't need newspapers. See, none of that. They operated outside of that whole, just that part of the system. Just operating outside of that, those narratives right there, made them a huge threat to the system. Why? Because they didn't want the settlers coming in, the people who they brought in, like that are already in the system. That was a very big danger, because these people are they're like, hey, these people are gonna start interacting with these other Native Americans, right? These tribes. Oh, they're gonna be over there in the Dakotas with the Sioux. Well, holy cow, if these people, you know, they tried to paint them as lazy, savages, barbaric, but then they realized that isn't gonna work. And so they started to be afraid of, like, if our people in our system move over, as we start integrating them, if they start being around these Indians, they are going to maybe become infected with their ideology, and maybe they won't want to be part of the system. Maybe they'll say, hey, wait a minute, these Indians out here, these Sioux or these Cheyenne, they have a pretty good way of life compared to me, you know, with some of the ways of life, you know, not everything, but they'll say, hey, they relax, hey, their way of thinking is this way on certain things. And then the people would start saying, wow, maybe we should adapt that. That would have been terrible for the system. They didn't need permission to live, the Indians. They just lived on their own. They were completely separate of the system. So they didn't need the government, the system. They operated from a generational memory and spiritual intuition. See, what they looked to for direction was not the system. And it wasn't what the system told people to look to. It was more like the Hebrew. Their way of thinking was ancestral. Oh, how do you say that? Their ancestors, you know, what was passed down. And that's what they went by, you know, and that's what the Hebrews went by, the ancient Hebrews. And it's a way of, they call it circular thinking instead of linear thinking. And the way the Indians think a lot is very similar to the ancient Hebrew way of thinking. It's circular instead of linear. And they operated, they had a land-based knowledge, so they could live off the land and they didn't need anything from the system. And that was a huge threat, because they didn't need the system for anything. And when the system would try to bribe them with blankets or whatever, the different stuff, they'd be like, oh, okay, this is great, this helps us. But then as soon as they said, hey, you're not getting any more of this if you don't change, you know, different times they'd be like, we're cutting off the supply of these things because you're not doing what we tell you. The Indians were just like, okay, fine, but we're not going to change. You can have your blankets back. You know what I mean? So that was a big threat. So, because they couldn't control them that way. And so also they kind of thrived in their system. And so like when they would get moved on to reservations, or they would the system would try to bring them in by bribing them with all this stuff, the Indians actually didn't live as well that way. Like when you study how they went on the reservations, and they were not, well, they didn't thrive in that environment. Where they thrived is completely separate from the government, without getting this stuff and being back on the land. And that's why they were all jumping the reservations, and they'd leave and they would thrive out there without the stuff. So that was a huge threat, because they didn't need the system. So the system, like, whereas most of us are completely dependent on the system, and, you know, shut off the toilet paper supply or shut off, you know, Netflix, and everybody's in panic mode and says, we'll do whatever you have, we'll do anything, just get us our toilet paper and Netflix back. You know, we're totally separated from that way. And so they were just a huge threat. And so I have here, it says, you can't run a world system when there's entire nations living well outside of your system. And so that's why they were a big threat. You had all the different Indian nations, you know, the Nez Perce, the Flathead, the Sioux, the Blackfeet, the Choctaw, the Seminole, all the way across this whole nation. So you had all these people, all these different nations, and they were fine, and didn't need this system. Well, that's a huge threat, because you can't allow that to go on. It's like right now, all the nations are under the control of the little system. And if a nation rose up and didn't want to participate and change, our system would destroy them, just like they did the Indians. And it was intentional that they did this to them. They tried to delete their culture, right? It wasn't just physically, it was they needed to get rid of the culture, the memory. So that's why they had boarding schools. They forced them to get rid of their language, and they demonized all their ceremonies they would do, which, by the way, some of their ceremonies and line up with, you know, very close to biblical Hebrew ceremonies. And so they wanted to replace the dependency with, you know, trauma, and they rewrote their history. A lot of the stuff that the Indians are taught now is not, I don't believe, is true about who they were. But that's a whole nother topic. But I wrote down here, it wasn't just about land. You know, they didn't just want their land, it was about legacy. If people remembered the old ways, the true ways, then the system, Satan's little system, couldn't survive. So that's why the big thing. It wasn't just about the land. I would say it was less about the land, and it was more about erasing who the Indians were and in the way that they lived. And how this fits into our day, our current time, is that the system still fears those who remember. If you start to remember stuff like this in a different way of life, you're going to be a threat. And if you feel it when you try to slow down. See, when you start to slow down and think outside of the way the system tells you to be always hustle bustle, you know, it's going to be a problem. Okay, my camera battery died. Okay, so how does this fit? Like, does it tie into today for us, or is it just history? Well, I don't think so. I think it has big implications for us. And I think that the system is going to see that as a big threat, because the system is afraid of people remembering this type of stuff. So these type of videos and this type of thought, as it becomes more popular, if it becomes more popular, will be seen as a threat by the system. And, you know, I think that, like, when you start adapting a little bit of this stuff into your life, you really see it. Like, when you start to try to just slow down and adapt just a little bit of the different way of life, like the Indian, just say, and there's other cultures too that would be this way, because all this came from the millennial kingdom. Living a whole different outlook on life. And so when you start to live a different way of life and you start to slow down a little bit, and your idea of what success is doesn't fit what they're telling you success is, and what work isn't the way they think work is, because you're not working then for the system, you're working for a different reason. All that starts to become issues for the system. But I think as you do that, or I do that, it just starts to make me more connected. You know, it's just like a domino effect. And so then when you're doing that, then all of a sudden you have time and you start thinking more. You start thinking deeper about issues like this. And then all of a sudden, you know, you're like asking more questions, right? I mean, it's just like a domino. All of a sudden you start waking up from the matrix. You're like, whoa, like, am I living in some, like, am I crazy? Or like, why am I all of a sudden starting to think all this stuff? And like, am I crazy? Because this doesn't line up with the system that I'm taught. Like, this is not how we're supposed to be. Am I being lazy? You know, what's going on with me? And I think that most of us, we have been in a trance since, because that's what they did. They taught us this stuff from grade school on up, or even before, and through all the indoctrination, TV, movies, books, we were indoctrinated with this. So it's like we're living in like this trance to keep us from remembering. That's the goal, is to keep us distracted and busy working and trying to be successful and making all this money that really doesn't make us feel good. Like, you have all these people, that singers that have all these millions of dollars, and what do? They're all on drugs, and they kill themselves, like Whitney Houston and all these people. Look at all the famous people that have OD'd, or killed themselves somehow. Because, I mean, well, wait a minute, they're supposed to be there at the top of the game, they're famous, they're making all the money. Well, apparently it didn't work for them. It didn't do the job. And so, we start waking up from it, right? And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. You start questioning things more and more. And that's what the system doesn't want. Satan's little seasoned system does not want you to start to wake up to who you were supposed to be and who you were meant to be. But that's what's going to happen. And we're not going to be part of the Satan's little season anymore. We're going to like start to cause problems. And that's probably our goal. Like, that's why we're here. We're meant to be here to cause some problems for the system, right? And so maybe this isn't just about the past. Like, a lot of these videos I'm doing, they're all about way 100 years ago or more. Maybe this is about the short season. And that playbook that was going on way back then when they were erasing the way of the Indians, and maybe it's the same playbook still going on. The playbook that that used to erase the Indians is still kind of the same playbook, right? And they're trying to erase us and have done a really good job of it, right? We're all just born into the system. So we don't have any memory, but here and there, certain people, I've seen this, you see it when you look at these things, you go, oh, wait a minute, that guy was back then, he knew, he woke up, he's thinking like I am, but it was 100 years ago. We're meant to wake up. Certain people are meant to wake up and not be deceived by the little season. And so my final thought that I'll end with, looking at my notes here, is that the more I look at it, the more I think we weren't meant to live like this, like the system, how we're taught, we weren't meant to live like this. And maybe those the system tried the hardest to erase were the ones who remembered what life was supposed to be. Like, think about that. You look at how the Indians were living, and when you really study it, they had a really good way of life. And maybe that's because they were still connected closer to what it was like during the millennial kingdom. And so they had survived, and Satan's deception, his little season, hadn't quite engulfed their area yet. So, interesting thoughts. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you on the next one. I better cut it off, because this video is going to be a long video. So, all right, guys, have a great week, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye.
This is Echo Pass Outpost checking in from the edge of the map. If you can hear this signal, you can still escape the Matrix.